So last unit, we discussed how slavery was entwined with the political institutions of the early American Republic. So to start the lecture for this unit, we're actually going to take a look into the dissenters of that system, who opposed this expansion of not only the United States into native nations, but also opposed the codification of slavery um, in the United States and in politics. Because around the 1830s and 1840s, the anti-slavery movement gained significant momentum in the United States. This sort of work that they did to build the movement in the 30s and 40s helped them in the 1850s to essentially launch the first anti-slavery party in United States history, the party of the Republicans, which was key in eventually abolishing slavery during the Civil War. So we're going to take a close look into that movement today. So the major goals of this class are first to understand the various reform movements of the 1830s through the 1850s. Second, be able to understand the flashpoints for the debates over slavery. And then lastly, be able to explain the anti-slavery movement overall and their goals. Because the anti-slavery movement was a sort of big tent movement that had a lot of different peoples with different ideologies on whether, for instance, the Constitution was pro-slavery or not, whether the anti-slavery movement should also advocate for women's suffrage, and there was a lot of different disagreements over these different goals, but they coalesce into a sort of a unified political movement by the middle of the 1850s. So first, what's important to note is the distinguishing between abolitionism and anti-slavery. And so there were a few people in the early 1800s who advocated for the abolition of slavery. And when I use the word abolition, I mean specifically they wanted to immediately and unequivocally end slavery throughout the United States. And it's worth noting, this was a very radical movement at the time. Very few people supported this degree of a political program. And so, nonetheless, while being very small, it was very outspoken. So prominent abolitionists began to set up newspapers and to try to advocate for the immediate ending of slavery throughout the United States, not just to stop the expansion of slavery, but to literally free people in places like South Carolina, Tennessee, Louisiana. And a few of these people were one person by the name of Elijah Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist who moved to Missouri, was actually involved in a lot of those debates over whether Missouri was going to be a slave state or a free state, and was advocating for Missouri to be admitted as a free state. Is eventually kind of run out of Missouri, settles in Illinois, and Illinois was a state that banned slavery. But this does not mean that Illinois was a state that was not racist. It was a very actually racist place, and did not really care that your average Illinois citizen didn't particularly care that slavery still existed in states right to the south of it, right? And Illinois was also a place that actually barred any African Americans from settling in Illinois. Um, and so this is sort of another sort of important addendum, right? Um, you had lots of states in the North that where slavery was banned, but this didn't necessarily mean that white Northerners supported racial equality or weren't incredibly racist. In fact, as not only was your sort of average white Illinoisan, very racist, they also were believed firmly that they did not even want African Americans as neighbors. They essentially saw slavery, the institution of slavery, as bad, not only because it how do I say this? It consolidated wealth and power in a white planter class, but also because people hated African Americans. And so when someone like Elijah Lovejoy settles in a place in Illinois and establishes an abolitionist newspaper saying, we need to abolish slavery, and saying that, it's against the will of God. This really bothers a lot of white Northerners, and so in the small town where he established his newspaper, his office is actually besieged by a mob, and Elijah Lovejoy is killed when he walks out of his office, thinking the mob is gone. Multiple people in the mob shoot him from covered positions, and he's essentially murdered. And so it was not safe for really anyone to advocate the abolition of slavery, especially in areas of the Midwest. You might be able to get away with it in places like Massachusetts, but anywhere out west, it was a very, very unpopular opinion and could get you killed, just like you got Elijah Lovejoy killed. And that's sort of the other key thing about abolitionism in the early 1800s. It often comes from strongly held religious beliefs, and specifically it comes out of Christianity. And these were people who firmly believed in the sort of Christian message that God created everyone equally. And from that belief, they adopt political views saying, if God created everyone equally, slavery as an institution is immoral, and needs to be abolished. And they sort of take their religious beliefs to a very logical conclusion. And so that's sort of a very common theme of these early abolitionists. They're very devout people, and they're acting on their religious beliefs. And so, another prominent member of this abolitionist community was William Lloyd Garrison, who I'm sure you have heard of, who founded the very sort of famous paper at the time, The Liberator, which was a prominent abolitionist newspaper. Some important things to note about William Lloyd Garrison is he not only advocated abolitionism, but he advocated a whole variety of different political beliefs sort of came with that. So first, Garrison argues that effectively the U.S. Constitution goes against all forms of sort of moral law. And so he very much thinks of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, and actually even publicly at one point burns the U.S. Constitution. So he sees the Constitution as an illegitimate document. And unsurprisingly, at the time, most Americans would have thought this was almost like treasonous, right? And so he's sort of very radical on that note. He also is a strong supporter of women's suffrage, and is a strong supporter of pacifism. He does not, in fact, support armed rebellions against slavery in the South. And these sort of very strongly held views on pacifism and on the Constitution will actually lead to many other many of his anti-slavery allies to actually sort of cut ties with him in the 1850s as the anti-slavery movement gains some political traction. And so that brings me to this last point that's really important to understand. There's a very big difference between abolitionism and political anti-slavery. People who support abolitionism often support these sort of very idealistic goals that are rooted in often in religion and often in Christianity. And those goals are advocating always for the immediate abolition of slavery. So people like William Lloyd Garrison, Elijah Lovejoy speak out against gradual emancipation plans that like New York and Connecticut adopt, which will eventually end slavery, but won't end slavery until 20, 30 years, and that really bothers these types of people. Whereas the political anti-slavery people are like, gradual abolition's great. Like whatever sort of starts to lead to slavery's decline, small steps are wonderful things, especially in a country that's strongly supporting slavery and a country where pro-slavery politicians have a monopoly on U.S. power, right? Like any small victory is useful. And so while folks like William Lloyd Garrison sort of, turn their nose up at being involved in the political process, um, other people who support anti-slavery are very willing to be involved in the political process, even if it means not necessarily advocating for the immediate abolishment of slavery. Um, the other interesting thing is the political anti-slavery people are more positive on the Constitution. They're people who actually argue that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and they try to use the traditions of the Constitution as a way to politically support the anti-slavery movement. Um, and as well, people who support political anti-slavery might argue against, for instance, the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And so they're not necessarily saying they want to go down into South Carolina and abolish slavery. They're simply saying slavery shouldn't be spread to places like Texas or in the 1820s, places like Missouri or Arkansas. So the anti-slavery movement and the abolitionist movement, while generally supporting the same sort of end goal, have very different ways to get there. There are also figures who really, through their life, sort of emerge anti-slavery sentiments and women's suffrage. Two prominent people are the Grimke sisters, Sarah Moore Grimke and Angelina Emily Grimke. Um, and they were two women who grew up in South Carolina and actually grew up in a family that enslaved people. And uh, to their credit, they saw this horrible institution of slavery, and they said they did not want to be a part of it. They left their family home, they immigrated to the North, and they strongly advocated against slavery in the North. And while doing so, they also supported the issues of women's suffrage, and even seeing two women regularly speaking in public against slavery was also a political act, saying that women's political views mattered. Women should be listened to in the society, and so through their own life, the Grimke sisters support support both women's suffrage and the anti-slavery movement. And this was sort of another aspect of the anti-slavery movement. You often had these sorts of lecture circuits that anti-slavery advocates went on and spoke to communities in the North. And tried to convince white Northerners to oppose slavery and to put pressure on their political representatives to oppose slavery. Because the thing was if you could convince white Northerners to go against slavery, you could start to counter the sort of political power that white Southerners and planters had in Congress. And so the white Northern public was who a lot of these anti-slavery politicians and activists were targeting. And there was an attempt to target enslavers and white planters in the South, especially in the early 1810s, 1820s. You see this as well from Quakers who actually strongly opposed slavery as an institution due to their religious beliefs. But for a variety of reasons, which we're going to talk about shortly, in the 1830s and 1840s, it becomes very difficult to actually try to convince white Southerners to oppose slavery. So a lot of that political persuasion campaign turns to the North. So one of the first campaigns that actually starts a lot of these stronger and larger reform movements is actually that of anti-Indian removal. and of the plight of the Cherokee Nation. So if you'll remember, the Cherokee Nation tries to fight their removal from their homelands through the Supreme Court and through a public relations campaign, essentially. And many people around the country hear about the lawsuits that the Cherokee Nation brings against their removal, and many people actually write and petition Congress directly to um, not only not support the Indian Removal Act, but also to stop the removal of the Cherokee from their homelands. And one interesting thing about this petition campaign is that it's actually predominantly women who write these petitions to Congress, and this is because in the 1800s it was almost like a social faux pas or seen as wrong for women to talk about politics in public. And so women socially could not go out and give speeches on political issues. And so it's through writing and petitioning Congress directly through letters that women are able to express their political views. And this petition campaign draws a lot of support. It's tens and tens of thousands of letters that are written to Congress about the Cherokee Nation. And this sort of builds a larger reform movement on a variety of different issues, including questions of temperance. So, for instance, the banning of alcohol, because alcohol often leads to drunken violence and domestic abuse in the home, right? And as well as the sort of adoption of more Christian morals, and the adoption of women's rights. And the women's rights movement starts to take off around this time. And so you have prominent people like the Grimke sisters going out and giving speeches against slavery and as women speaking on the most controversial issue in the country, which is a huge deal. But you also have other prominent women arguing for women's rights and suffrage. People like Lucretia Mott and Katie Elizabeth Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, and this women's rights movement sets up a women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York, one of the first of its kind, in July of 1848, and including all the people I just mentioned. Actually, Frederick Douglass is there as well as one of the only African American delegates to the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca, and advocates that the convention should include a call for women's suffrage in the country. And it's worth mentioning as well this view, calling for the vote for women, is very unpopular. It is not something that male politicians, are going to get behind, and it's very, very unpopular among most people, men and women in the United States at the time. But it sets an important precedent, and it lays the groundwork for the women's rights movement in the late 1800s that will eventually give women the right to vote after World War I. And so this is sort of another key part of the reform movement of various reform movements at the time. So politically in Congress, there were also people seeking to advocate for anti-slavery goals and supporting this reform movement. And part of the reason for that is that people in the United States, and especially politicians and white Southerners, go from supporting the institution of slavery as like a necessary evil or just something that exists to being a positive good. And this is the word of Governor of South Carolina, John Calhoun, who very much supports slavery as actually a good social institution, or makes that argument. And this really bothers lots of white Northerners who really do see slavery as immoral and want to take some sort of political action against it. And Congress gets so bugged by these petitions, not only to support the Cherokee Nation, but also against slavery. The anti-slavery petition campaign begins as well, again with lots of women actually writing in. So Congress gets so annoyed by this petitioning campaign that they actually, in the House of Representatives, start to initiate this thing called the gag rule. And the gag rule bans not only the sending of petitions and anti-slavery petitions to Congress, but also bans politicians from giving speeches that mention or discuss the issue of slavery. And again, this really bugs white Northerners because even if you're a white Northerner back then who doesn't really care about slavery as an issue, at this point you have people advocating and saying that you are not allowed to even speak on the issue of slavery. So essentially the pro-slavery representatives turn the issue of slavery into a free speech issue. And that gets a lot of notice from John Quincy Adams, the former president of the United States between 1825 and 1829, and also at the time, the only president besides his father, John Adams, to be a president who did not personally enslave people. And John Quincy Adams, during his presidency, wasn't particularly anti-slavery, right? Slavery wasn't abolished during John Quincy Adams' presidency. The kind of expansion of slavery westward kind of continues unabated during his presidency. But he wasn't radically pro-slavery. And this issue of free speech really bugs him. And he starts to try to get the House of Representatives to remove the gag rule. And he actually starts reading some of these petitions on the floors of the House of Representatives, arguing against slavery, against the sort of rules of the House of Representatives. Because John Quincy Adams might be one of the only former presidents whose actual post-presidency is in some ways more important than his presidency, because he serves as a representative from Massachusetts for a long time and becomes a prominent member of the House of Representatives who opposes the expansion of slavery west and becomes a part of the anti-slavery movement. And it's through this sort of attack on the gag rule that the anti-slavery politicians and activists start building support against slavery as an institution. So one major flashpoint in this national debate about slavery that comes up in sort of fits and starts is that of the Mexican-American War. And so the last we talked about the Spanish colonies was the revolutions out west. And if you remember, the Comanche Empire starts expanding into areas of Spanish colonial rule in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And it's in the early 1800s that you have huge revolutions against the Spanish Empire. And so the country of Mexico was established in 1821 after the Mexican Revolution. And Mexico is seeking to try to control the northern parts of their country, which extend all the way east to modern-day Texas, and all the way north up to really even parts of northern Colorado and arguably even Oregon, and then west to California. But the thing is Mexico doesn't actually control these regions. The Comanche nation actually has a substantial amount of control of this area and regularly raids down into Mexico. And so the response of Mexico is to actually appeal to American settlers because they know American settlers are seeking to constantly move west, constantly get new land. And so they actually in the 1820s, invite American settlers to settle in modern day Texas, um, and almost provide a buffer for the Mexican government, a group of armed American settlers who can fight against the Comanches to essentially help secure Mexico, right? And so American settlers are invited in. The interesting thing is the American settlers are white Southerners who support plantation agriculture and slavery. And so they are seeking to move cotton production into the sort of rich lands in modern day eastern Texas, sort of north of Houston, in between Dallas and Houston. And so they enslave people and bring them into Texas. And the interesting thing at the time is the Mexican Constitution bans slavery. And so American settlers, though they're required, even though they're invited to Mexico, they're required to follow Mexican law. They refuse to follow Mexican law against slavery. And this leads to a lot of tension between the Mexican government and the region of Texas. And after a more centralized government under Santa Anna takes control of Mexico, they begin to try to enforce this anti-slavery petition or law in Texas, and it actually leads to an armed revolt by American settlers against Mexico, which leads to the war for Texas independence, leads to the Alamo and all of that, which we do not have time to get into, so we're not going to talk about it. But the important thing you need to know by this is Texas gains its independence from Mexico at this time, sort of, and de facto rules itself. However, the Mexican government does not recognize Texas as an independent nation, even though the United States, France, and Britain do. And so this then leads to a lot of U.S.-Mexico tension between U.S. and Mexico, as Texas immediately petitions the U.S. government to be admitted as a state to the United States. And so this puts the United States government in sort of a complicated situation, right? Because white Southerners would love Texas to be admitted as a state. Oh, great. Another slave state to shore up our power and protect slavery from federal government institution. That's wonderful. And so, white Southerners are being like, oh, absolutely. They're Americans. Bring them in, right? But of course, the moment that the United States admits Texas as a state, you've essentially annexed a portion of Mexico illegally, and you might start a war with Mexico. This might lead to a huge conflict. But these white Southerners who are supporting admitting Texas into the United States have some important allies, because American settlers now know of California and that there are very rich lands in California. And California would be a state that would probably be populated by Northerners and by people who oppose slavery. And so this is actually bringing a lot of Americans sort of together. You can both take Texas and California, right? And in fact, their American settlers begin to sort of illegally occupy parts of Mexican California and start little skirmishes out there as well. And so the sort of northern area of Mexico does not have much state control over, and American settlers are putting a lot of pressure on these territories to essentially sort of illegally annex them from Mexico. And so this leads to a sort of coalition of people who are actively supporting war with Mexico. But the problem is they need a justification. They can't just randomly start declaring war on Mexico. That makes the United States sort of look like an empire, look like warmongers. It doesn't really fit with American ideology. And so they need Mexico to look like the aggressors. And so James K. Polk, who is a prominent politician president from Tennessee at the president of the United States, but a prominent politician from Tennessee at the time, who also has a lot of land holdings in Tennessee and really would like some land in Texas, very much like Andrew Jackson during his presidency, right? Is trying to engineer a way to get the United States involved in this war. And so he orders troops actually sent to the border of Texas and Mexico, and orders troops sent into a sort of disputed area, and that is the sort of region between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers, and this was a border that was not clear between the Republic of Texas and Mexico. It was arguably Mexican territory, and so, as American troops actually enter in this disputed territory, which is, arguably the territory of Mexico, they are attacked by a small Mexican unit, which leads to a skirmish and leads to some American soldiers being killed. And so this is their justification. And so now supporters of a Mexican-American conflict come and say, look, American blood was shed on American soil. We were attacked. It's now time for a defensive protective war against Mexico, right? Well, there are actually some politicians who question this, including a young lawyer from Illinois who is a new representative in the House of Representatives by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln starts asking, where was the exact place where American soldiers were killed? Were they in fact killed on American territory? Or were they in fact killed trespassing on Mexican territory? And he's very particular about this, as Lincoln kind of always is, and is in the way he talks. He's always very sort of picky about his language, and about making sure the facts are the facts. And this actually bugs a lot of other representatives who start derisively calling him Spotty Abe Lincoln. He's so concerned about the spots where American soldiers are killed. Who cares? American soldiers are killed. Therefore, the war is a justification, right? And so you start to see a group of white Northern politicians who's really bothered by this. They're bothered by the way that white Southerners instituted and sort of created conditions for this war for slavery, to expand slavery further west, and to then, of course, again, through the Three-Fifths Compromise, get more representatives to advocate for slavery. And so the Mexican-American War really is seen by a lot of the white Northern public as a war for slavery. And this starts to sow the seeds in the 1840s for the eventual emergence of the Republican Party, which, again, will be one of the most prominent first anti-slavery parties in the country. And so it's not just that you have an anti-slavery movement that sort of begins around this time and is actively pushing the Northern public. You also have pro-slavery Southern politicians sort of pushing a more pro-slavery stance that begins to alienate parts of the northern U.S. public. And it's also worth mentioning at this time, in the South itself, pro-slavery politicians adopt more anti-democratic methods. And so abolitionists and anti-slavery activists start sending abolitionist papers and letters down south to try to convince people that slavery is morally wrong. And in response to this, Southern politicians are very worried that this propaganda might actually be pretty effective and might actually start movements in Southern states to abolish slavery. And so they actually ban abolitionist literature by being sent through the U.S. Post Office, and any abolitionist mailing and letters and literature is actually confiscated at post offices in the South. So this starts to lead to a media environment that becomes a lot more sort of cloistered in the South from anti-slavery sentiment. And so, again, you're beginning to see in the 1840s two very different camps emerging in the North and the South that leads to a divergence of the white Northern public and the white Southern public over the issue of slavery. And the Mexican-American War is sort of a very prominent event that also catalyzes this. One other reason why Southern politicians are so worried about abolitionist mailings and newsletters and pamphlets is that they're worried that these letters and propaganda might get, and I don't mean propaganda in sort of a bad way. Propaganda is just kind of ways you sort of advocate for specific issues, right? But they're worried that these abolitionist newspapers and writings might get in the hands of enslaved peoples, who then might take action against slavery. And one of the most common ways that enslaved peoples fought against slavery was by running away, was by trying to escape to freedom, and escape slavery and start a new life, either in the North or in Canada. And this was an option that enslaved peoples could use, but it very much depended on geography. If you were enslaved down in Mississippi or down on the Mississippi River in Louisiana, it would be very difficult for you to escape north, because the moment you get away from the plantation you were enslaved on, you have to go through a landscape of areas of a huge country where it is not permissible for African Americans to sort of be out by themselves, right, and be on the streets by themselves. And if they were questioned. Where are you from? Who's your master? This sort of stuff. And so you could be very easily caught and found and sent back into slavery. And so it'd be very tough for people from the lower South to escape slavery, even though people tried, right? Even if you couldn't escape all the way to Canada, people would try to hide out in the woods, hide out in the swamps. Some people tried to escape to the Seminole Nation down in Florida, at least before their removal. And then other people tried to actually escape to Mexico, which was another very prominent route for enslaved people to try to escape slavery, because again, Mexico banned slavery. So you could actually start up a new life there. But for the most part, the Underground Railroad functioned in ways to try to get people out of border states, out of places like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia definitely would be close enough, maybe Tennessee. And so there were routes that people could take to try to escape to the north, and then from the north escape all the way to Canada, because there was always a risk in the north of, if you had escaped slavery, people coming and your enslavers coming north and traveling north and trying to find you and bring you back into slavery, and that risk gets really magnified in 1850, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I want to talk a little bit more general about the Underground Railroad. And so the Underground Railroad functioned in many parts of northern states. There were some routes that went through Indiana, many that went through Pennsylvania and New York, but actually Ohio was sort of the center of the Underground Railroad. So this here is a map of the from the Ohio History Connection, which shows the various different routes people took to get to Canada and to escape and get to freedom. And you'll notice here, a lot of these routes not only go through sort of, prominent cities in Ohio, like Columbus right here, and Cincinnati down here, and of course Cleveland, but also go through a lot of different small towns. And in fact, it's a lot of these smaller towns in northern Ohio and northeastern Ohio where you have had prominent networks of abolitionists and of people who were anti-slavery, including Oberlin, which was the town where Oberlin College was founded, one of the first multiracial colleges established in the country. Um, and so there were many people in Ohio who worked on the Underground Railroad and tried to help people escape slavery. And it's worth mentioning this was a multiracial alliance to enable freedom. So absolutely, African Americans who were free and who lived in Ohio definitely supported this movement. But also, white Northerners were heavily involved in the Underground Railroad, and through running a series of safe houses in these various different towns throughout Ohio, were able to successfully keep people who are escaping from slavery hidden, and allow them to escape to Canada, to places like Port Stanley, St. Catharines, um, and Kingsville, other areas in modern day Ontario that had large free black communities. Um, and so over a period of around 20 years, around 30,000 African Americans successfully escaped to Canada. And many more escaped simply to the north and settled in the north and in African American communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and in New York. And the lives they built for themselves in these new places, were not easy. These are still places that had significant amounts of racism in them, right? White northern communities were still very racist against African Americans. It was hard to find work, and to have access to civil rights and justice. And many of these communities were at the time segregated, so these were not wonderful places to live for African Americans. But it was a completely different society than being enslaved on a tobacco plantation or a cotton plantation in the South. It just cannot compare. There's a reason why people escaped slavery, and escaped the horrible, brutal violence of slavery as well. And so that was the primary method for African Americans to resist slavery, and it was a method that had a profound impact on U.S. politics, because this was noticed by white enslavers. They noticed how people were able to escape slavery, and that actually led to tensions between the North and the South as Southern states started to put pressure on Northern politicians and say, hey, you know, your citizens are harboring and people escaping slavery, and that's leading to loss of property and loss of labor, and we want the people when we enslaved, we want them back. And so the simple act of actually escaping to freedom actually turns slavery into a national institution, turns slavery into a national debate, and puts the issue of slavery on the minds of white politicians who, in the 1810s and 1820s, and even in the 1830s, were mainly arguing about economic issues of tariffs, issues of taxation. But slavery starts to become a prominent national issue in the 1840s and the 1850s especially. So, following the Mexican-American War, the federal government now had to decide how would this new territory seized from Mexico be incorporated into the new nation. And so Texas was already admitted as a slave state to the Union. And this already made a lot of Northern politicians very, very angry, because they already opposed the Mexican-American War, and they thought it was a war for slavery. And sure enough, here comes Texas as a slave state, more land for slavery to expand into, which they very much opposed at the time. And so the compromise had to both ameliorate these sort of opinions of white Northerners, but also ameliorate the opinions of uh, pro-slavery politicians in the South who were getting really annoyed at the success of the Underground Railroad and the continued escaping of enslaved peoples to the North. And so the Compromise of 1850 does a few things. So first, it admits California as a free state. So this was one piece of territory that was taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, and California will be admitted as a free state to balance out Texas as a slave state. Now you're back up to your equal number of senators in the Senate. But the next thing it does is it actually bans the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And this was something that many anti-slavery Northern politicians were really bothered by. The fact that in the capital, enslaved people were put up on market to be sold. And it was sort of embarrassing to visitors and especially to foreign nationals who were in D.C. And so this was something they wanted for a long time. So the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. And however, for pro-slavery politicians, there's an agreement that the Fugitive Slave Act will be passed. And the Fugitive Slave Act was a new piece of legislation that would enforce something that was actually in the Constitution, but never really got enforced. In the Constitution was this thing called the Fugitive Slave Law. And basically it was a rule saying that if enslaved people escaped slavery, that they could be taken back and re-enslaved to their residence in southern states. And that wasn't that important at the time of the signing of the Constitution because really almost no states had banned slavery at the time. But in 1850, you have lots of people fleeing slavery and escaping into the North and into free northern communities. And plantation owners and enslavers wanted to be able to go into, say, Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts and re-enslave people and take them back into slavery. And so the Fugitive Slave Act was legislation with teeth that would allow enslavers to go to U.S. Marshals and to force people back into slavery if they could find them in these northern communities. And this really sets up a lot of debate in the North about the question of slavery. But it's worth mentioning at this point, the Compromise of 1850 is kind of unlike the Missouri Compromise or previous compromises over slavery. Previous compromises over slavery do a pretty good job of sort of bringing the issue out of the political debate. This does the opposite, especially the Fugitive Slave Act actually increases tension in the country over the question of slavery, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So, what are the consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act? Well, one key thing is before the Fugitive Slave Act, white Northerners could very easily ignore what was happening down in the South. Yes, you had these anti-slavery folk, you had abolitionists like William Ward Garrison, running his printing press, trying to encourage white Northerners through these sorts of religious appeals to oppose slavery in the South. And for the most part, your average white Northerner just kind of ignored them. They didn't really care because the issue of slavery didn't really affect them, right? They went about their normal lives. Yeah, sure, slavery was down there, but who cares? As long as there were sort of places to move out west, there was free farmland in the West where they could not be bothered by slavery as an institution, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And so your average white Northerner in 1850 doesn't really care about slavery. And so the only people who really care about it are abolitionists who are like 30% of the population, something like that. And of course, African Americans, free African Americans in the North who, want the country to move on this issue, right? Well, that really begins to change with the Fugitive Slave Act. Because what the Fugitive Slave Act does is it leads to people, it leads to white planters coming in to northern communities and trying to re-enslave people. And what originally was an abstraction was, yeah, people were enslaved in the South, who cares? Starts to become more personal and become real when white planters show up and they bring people back into slavery. And they're not just bringing some random person back into slavery. They're bringing your neighbor down the street back into slavery. They're bringing your tailor. They're bringing your cobbler, or um, uh, or your servant, right? They're bringing people in your neighborhood who and they're re-enslaving them. And this really, really angers white Northerners. Um, and we can kind of see this with the story of Anthony Burns. Now, Anthony Burns was a person who was enslaved in, I believe, North Carolina, um, and he's able to successfully escape and makes a new life for himself in Boston, settles in Boston. And using the Fugitive Slave Act, his previous enslaver finds out where he's living in Boston through a letter and goes to Boston to try to re-enslave him. And he finds where he is, and he uses the U.S. Marshals to bring him back into slavery. And there there's sort of a complicated story here. We don't necessarily need to get into the whole story. There's a trial as to whether Anthony Burns escaped slavery. Or whether he's a free person. And there's a lot of sort of ruckus that happens with this. But what it ends with is Anthony Burns being marched through the streets of Boston, guarded by 140 troops, by 140 soldiers, to go to the ship to be sent back down south and re-enslaved by this white planter. And the response of the Bostonian public is unequivocal. Thousands, tens of thousands of people come out and protest his re-enslavement. And so, as Anthony Burns just marched through the streets, 50,000 people show up in the streets protesting him being sent back into slavery. And this is such an incredible change in white Northern opinion. 10 years ago, white Northerners didn't care about this. In fact, many of them were pro-slavery. But by 1850, or in this case, by 1854, you have 50,000 protesters against the enslavement of one person. And suddenly, a lot of the Northern public is vehemently anti-slavery. And there was a person who talks about this in his journal, and he says, quote, we went to bed one night, conservative unionists, not really caring about the question of slavery. And he said the next morning, after Anthony Burns is marched back into slavery, he says the next morning we all woke up stark mad abolitionists. And this is sort of what happens. The Fugitive Slave Act makes the issue of slavery personal to Northerners, and it brings up this question of political rights and Northern rights. Northerners want to live in a society that's free, and now they're being forced to look at the evils of slavery square in the face. They do not like what they're seeing. And lastly, there's a big cultural impact by multiple different things in the North. One of them being Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a book published by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is a prominently anti-slavery book, which radicalizes the white Northern public. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is being read throughout the entire North. It's one of the most popular books at the time. And it's not just a book. It turns into a cultural phenomenon. There are basically like
rudimentary sort of movies that are created and almost shown in areas in the North, where you start having almost theatrical productions, but it's almost like kind of animating these movies with sets and slides that are uh, being run through on not exactly a screen, but kind of live with cutouts and stuff. I'm not really doing it justice, but essentially what you get is Uncle Tom's Cabin is actually turned into multiple forms of media. It's turned into plays. It's turned into these movers, these kind of rudimentary sort of films, essentially, and it's turned into musicals. It becomes a massive phenomenon throughout the North, and these things tour from city to city to city to city, and every one of these tours is spreading anti-slavery sentiment through every one of these towns, as like white planters are showing up and actively re-enslaving people in northern cities. And so this creates this huge moment where suddenly all of that work being done by abolitionists to try to wake up the northern public happens and succeeds in the early 1850s and creates an anti-slavery northern public in the 1850s. And so this leads not only into important cultural consequences in terms of anti-slavery sentiment among your average person in the North, it leads to political consequences. So you have the collapse of the Whig Party, which we talked about briefly in the last unit. And the Whig Party was a party that didn't really talk about slavery that much, or was perhaps even a little bit pro-slavery. But they had avoided, at least in the 1840s, trying to not mention slavery because they knew a lot of their supporters were very divided on it. But this Northern public, by the mid 1850s, is very anti-slavery, and the Whig Party completely collapses. And is destroyed as a political party, and it's replaced by a bunch of different parties. You have the Free Soiler Party that actually runs a presidential candidate in I believe 1852, and that's strongly anti-slavery, not exactly abolitionist, still actually quite racist. But it gets a lot of support. And then you also have another political party called the Know Nothings, and they're actually an anti-immigrant party. And they instead of focusing on anti-slavery, they focus on anti-immigration. They're very anti-Irish, incredibly xenophobic, but they're actually getting a lot of supporters in the North around this time. But because of the Fugitive Slave Act, because of the incredible cultural movement of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Northern public is mostly concerned about the issue of slavery by the mid 1850s, and so this leads to the rise of a new party called the Republican Party, which is founded on the principles of anti-slavery. They pare down that sort of nativist, xenophobic stuff that the Know Nothings were doing, and they channel it all towards anti-slavery. And they actually take over a lot of the constituencies of the Know Nothing parties, which is this constituency was generally middle class, very white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, not immigrant. But all of that energy from the Know Nothings is now channeled into anti-slavery instead of anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is a huge success. Effectively, through this long history of anti-slavery activism and abolitionism, the work of William Lloyd Garrison, of Frederick Douglass, eventually, of all these different people, of the Grimke sisters, comes to fruition in the 1850s, not through that sort of heavily religious movement that the abolitionism was originally based in, but through these political sentiments, through the political changes that are happening in the 1850s, and through Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it creates a Republican Party, an anti-slavery party. And so for the first time in really the history of the First Republic, in America, for the first time in American history, you have an anti-slavery party with the Republicans, and you have a pro-slavery party for the most part with the Democrats. Um, but even the Democrats are really getting fractured at this moment, as even Northern Democrats are becoming anti-slavery. And we'll talk about the collapse of the Democratic Party in the next lecture. But it's worth mentioning just what an incredible success this is in terms of activism, fighting for anti-slavery. And, people who were run out of northern towns, who were killed and murdered by pro-slavery mobs in places like Illinois, in the 1850s, those same types of people are talked about as heroes, as the leaders of an incredible movement to fight against the slave power. This sort of almost conspiracy, talking about how much pro-slavery politicians controlled the government, and the creation of the Republican Party really leads to a situation where slavery is going to be the only main issue talked about in national party politics, and where you're going to have significant tension between anti-slavery and pro-slavery sides. And it's going to lead to a huge rupture in the national fabric over the question of slavery, which will eventually lead to the Civil War. But I hope this lecture was helpful in understanding, where these dissenters of against this sort of first American Republic, where they came from, what their ideologies were, and to show as well that the sort of country that Thomas Jefferson and eventually and especially Andrew Jackson creates, this super pro-slavery, incredibly expansionistic country that is pretty horrific in terms of how it treats people. While the majority of the population supported it in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there was a dissenting movement, and that dissenting movement mattered and creates incredible political change by 1850, where suddenly people are recognizing how evil slavery is, right? And so I want you to both kind of hold in your head both of these things. That yes, the United States before the Civil War was a horrific place, with horrible structural inequalities. And yet, the American Revolution creates a little spark of people who are dissenters of the system. People who actually believe that Americans are created equal and actually fight for political and economic and civil rights for all people in the United States. And it's this dissenting movement that actually has a huge impact on American history. And so, in our next lecture, we're going to see, what does this dissenting movement create? How does this fracture over slavery lead to the Civil War? And how does the Civil War destroy the first American Republic and begin a second American Republic and effectively a second American Revolution?